Hello again, and welcome to our next module here in our ethics course. And in this module, we're going to be introducing a major school of thought within the field of ethics, namely utilitarianism. And we're going to be doing that by beginning with the person who's typically credited as the founder of utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill. And we're going to be taking a look at his work called Utilitarianism. And in this module, I'm going to introduce you to some of the background for that work and some of the basic ideas of utilitarianism so that you'll be better prepared than to read a fair bit of it yourself and understand what he's arguing for there and then discuss it on Blackboard. And one of the things to note about this is if you're not really done much ethics before, this is probably the most widespread, the most influential non-religious ethical system in our world and certainly in our nation today. If you ask typical Americans what they believe makes things right or wrong, you're going to get a lot of religious answers from people, and some of those people would fall within a kind of natural law type of ethical system. But they might not tend to describe it that way, and they probably wouldn't be really consistent and well-versed in the principles of natural law theory. But apart from Christian responses, I think the most widespread ethical system that people would say they followed or that they follow in principle, even if they don't use the terms, would be utilitarianism, which basically says that things are right or wrong depending on the consequences they produce, and in particular by how much pleasure and pain different actions or different ways of behaving produce. So we're going to be introduced to this. This is something that's very influential in our world today. And this module is going to introduce us to the real basics of it and the founder in John Stuart Mill. And then in the next module, we're going to look at a more recent version of utilitarianism put out by the living philosopher Peter Singer, who is a particular type of utilitarianism that follows obviously much later along from Mill. So to introduce you to Mill and his ideas, let's turn now to the next page. Now before we dive into Mill and utilitarianism, I wanted to step back for a moment and get some sense of where we've been so far and where we are in the class and in thinking about ethics when we look at Mill. And if you'll recall back from the beginning of the class, I talked about how the most basic level of ethics is called meta-ethics. That is asking questions about what is it that makes certain kinds of actions right or wrong? Where ultimately do our moral, ethical principles come from? And so far in the class, we've seen a variety of ways of answering those questions. We started off by looking at McIntyre, who argued that the way society answers those questions today has gone very badly wrong, and that we need to return to a more traditional way of thinking about right and wrong and get away from the modern ways. So that introduced us to kind of why these issues are important. Then we looked at Aristotle, who offers us an objective standard for what makes things right or wrong. And when we talk about meta-ethics or ethics, it really falls into two main categories. There's objective ethical systems, which are going to say that there is in fact an objective standard somewhere that different people could refer to and determine whether or not a particular action or whether or not a particular rule of action is moral or immoral. Right? So an objective ethical system has some standard that multiple people could look at and reach a unified, agreed upon answer about whether or not this is right or wrong. And Aristotle's ethical system is that type of system. It's objective. And what is the standard for what makes things right or wrong in Aristotle's ethics? Well, Aristotle gives us basically a form of what's called virtue ethics. And so what makes things right or wrong is whether or not they tend to produce certain habits or certain virtues, and that really ultimately something is good because it produces virtue, which taken together the virtues lead to this flourishing life, eudaimonia, that he talked about. And so, while we might need to clarify what kind of an action a certain act is, what the circumstances might be, as far as Aristotle's concerned, once we really understand an action and the circumstances and intentions around it, it either does lead to developing a virtue or it does not. And it's either right or it is wrong. And that's something that we can objectively answer based on what result it has in terms of developing a person's moral character. Now, closely related to this is the natural law tradition, which also traces its roots back to Aristotle, but also in kind of modern versions moves in slightly different direction from Aristotle, and really focuses on an understanding of human nature, and says, well, look, certain things are part of human nature. We're designed to work a certain way, and some actions fit with that design and help us reach the goal we were designed to reach, and other actions don't fit with the way human beings are put together, doesn't fit our nature, and doesn't help us reach the end we were designed to reach. So an action that fits with our nature and helps us develop it is moral, and one that doesn't is not moral, is immoral. And so again, there can be some debate in figuring out what is really part of our nature and what things are kind of particular cultural developments and not really part of human nature per se. But again, those are things that we can work out. And once we work through the process, we can reach a kind of definitive, objective answer about whether or not an action is right or wrong according to natural law. Now, here is where we, of course, get the big break. And in particular, this results from the developments in modern philosophy, particularly skepticism. Once we aren't certain about how we can know anything, or how we can know certainly things like abstract moral principles or a permanent kind of human nature, that's going to make it very difficult, if not impossible, to follow these other ethical systems that we just talked about. And so the focus tends to move away from an objective outside standard into an interior standard, or subjectivism, right? Which means that right and wrong is not based on some standard that we could all look at. It's instead based on internal states, and in particular, my feelings, my perceptions, my emotions. And so obviously this leads us to someone like Hume, who many people would see as basically the father of emotivism, right? Which you'll recall is the ethical system that McIntyre criticized so much in our very first module, right? And this basically says, really, when we make statements about something being right or wrong, or moral or immoral, what we're really expressing is that this type of action makes me feel good or makes me feel bad. And now Hume adds, of course, an attempt to get beyond a purely internal standard to say, well, we have to think about how other people would view this. But again, it's ultimately based on kind of our internal subjective feelings and what we think other people would feel as well when they saw this action, or when they saw this quality in a person expressed in different actions. And so given Hume's belief that we can't really know outside truths in the same way that you could in the classic moral systems, what we're left with is, again, this appeal to emotions. Right? And of course, if our moral judgments are ultimately based on whether this makes me feel good or not, there's no real way for us to decide who's right and who's wrong if two people disagree. If I say, well, look, I see this action and it gives me pleasant feelings when considering the qualities of the person who performed this action, but if it gives someone else unpleasant feelings, if they feel badly about it, how do we decide who is correct and who is not? And also, as I tried to raise in some of the questions, what happens if we live in a society where we all agree, say something like slavery is perfectly acceptable, and I don't feel any displeasure when I see someone owning a slave or punishing a slave. Therefore, there's no ethical problem there. And that's going to strike most of us as a problem for an ethical system if it's going to approve of slavery. So Hume's emotional basis for ethics is going to fit with the way that we tend to be skeptical today about whether we can know things, but it also seems problematic, particularly on some issues. Now Nietzsche, again, he doesn't really lay out a clear ethical system. What he primarily does is to criticize the traditional ethics, like virtue ethics, like natural law. And he's going to argue that those ethical systems are in fact based on this slave mentality, and that restraining ourselves, restraining our desires, practicing moderation, those things are projections from the slaves who aren't able to pursue their desires, who aren't able to exercise their will. And basically he's arguing that we claim or we think these values come from an understanding of human nature or an understanding of the virtues, but they are in fact projections of resentment from the slave class. And so he's going to critique the kind of objective classical philosophical systems. And in its place, he basically offers, again, another form of subjective ethics, that what we ought to do is to realize our will to power, that I ought to pursue what it is that's going to make me feel noble and fulfilled and successful and heroic. And that's going to vary from person to person, but it's really that it's our internal will, it's the internal feeling of empowerment that we get from living this way. That's the standard of ethics for Nietzsche to a large extent. So where does this leave us, right? Why do I go through all of this? Well, basically, for many people, this is a real problem in thinking about ethics. There are a lot of people who have accepted much of the skeptical argument, and they aren't willing to accept kind of the traditional ideas about virtue or about kind of what is truly part of human nature in a metaphysical sense. So they don't want to accept the kind of classic virtue ethics or natural law. But on the other hand, we don't want to say that right and wrong is just a matter of emotions, or that ethical guidelines are just a projection from a slave mentality and that we should all just assert our will. These don't seem like very attractive options to many people when they're thinking about how we ought to decide what's right and wrong. So where does this leave us? Well, we want an objective standard, but we want an objective standard that doesn't require us to believe in something like human nature or clear, understandable virtues. We need something more concrete, basically, something we can have a more scientific knowledge of, for lack of a better term. And this is, I think, where utilitarianism really gains its prominence, because this gives us an answer. It is something that is objective, that we can all work through a situation and really reach a common decision about what is the best moral course of action. And it doesn't require belief in souls or metaphysics or human nature in a kind of permanent sense. It just requires an understanding of, on a very basic level, the existence of pleasure and pain, which again can be personally perceived and to some extent even scientifically measured in today's world. So utilitarianism gives us an objective standard for morality that's not rooted in kind of metaphysical beliefs or certainly in a religious tradition. And I think that's what makes it so attractive in today's ethical environment. So now, to explain a little bit about what utilitarianism actually is, we'll turn to the next page to give you the early history of utilitarianism and the precursors to Mill. Now, not surprisingly, John Stuart Mill in the 19th century was not the first person to think that pleasure and pain had something to do with morality. And then, of course, we've seen, I think, in all of the different philosophers and philosophies that we've looked at, there is reference to pleasure and pain. But of course, say, for example, Aristotle certainly doesn't think that pleasure and pain are the basis for morality. They are things that can either work to help us be moral, or they can be obstacles that lead us away from what is truly moral. But they're certainly not the basis for what things are right and wrong. But of course, there were even people in the ancient world who disagreed with Aristotle and who thought, in fact, that that's really all there is to evaluating human actions. Do they tend to produce pleasure and happiness, or do they tend to produce pain and suffering? And those things that produce pleasure are good, and those things that produce pain are bad, right? And this follows from a very kind of basic thinking about human actions, right? We tend to go after things that we think are going to be pleasurable, and we tend to avoid things that are going to cause pain. Now, some people, of course, argue that in some instances, and perhaps even in many instances, we ought to deny ourselves pleasure for some higher good, or endure pain for some greater good. But there are certainly those who would say, well, maybe in some cases, but ultimately it really is the pleasure and pain that matters. And so the classic example of that was the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who is the founder of Epicureanism, which is a ancient philosophical school, comes after Aristotle in his time. But basically, the Epicureans are materialists. They think there's no spirit, there's no soul. All there is matter and bodies. And given that all we have is this bodily existence here and now, well, look, the most reasonable course of action is to live in a way that's going to provide you with the greatest amount of pleasure. Now, to be fair, the Epicureans didn't conclude from this that, well, what you ought to do is to go out and party and live a wild lifestyle and enjoy as much kind of really basic, lower pleasure as possible. They would certainly say that there are a range of pleasures, which is going to include kind of higher pleasures of things like education or career success or standing in the community. But ultimately, that's what it's going to boil down to, is those are not valuable in and of themselves. They're valuable because they give us a particular kind of pleasure. And so Epicurean ideas go back at least to the 3rd and 4th century BC, and certainly probably before that as well. And that train of thought is part of the history of philosophy all through the intervening centuries. When you get up to closer to modern times, the person in the generation before Mill who really kind of reintroduced this idea into modern philosophy was a man by the name of Jeremy Bentham. And Bentham lived right around the turn of the 18th to 19th century, and he basically argued for a really quite simple equation between pleasure being good, pain being bad. And so Bentham essentially argues that when we're looking at an action or a choice, really the only thing that we need to do to determine what's the right or wrong thing to do is to figure out some way to sum up the pleasure and pain produced by this action, and whatever produces the most just basic pleasure and the least amount of pain, that's the right action. And so he talks about, how it is we would do this, what are the different variables we need to consider. But ultimately, it just boils down to, on a really basic level, what's going to give us the most pure pleasure versus the least amount of pain, and that's what we ought to do. And again, on a fairly simple, straightforward basis. So he's referring back to a long tradition, but kind of reintroduces it into modern philosophical discourse around 1800 or so. Now, Bentham's ideas have some influence, but he also gets a lot of kind of negative reaction to this idea. There had been a long tradition of particularly Christian reaction against these ideas that gets reignited by Bentham's statements. And so Bentham really doesn't have that large of an impact on ethics and philosophy as a whole. It's really his successor, John Stuart Mill, who takes Bentham's ideas and develops them, who really has the kind of lasting influence. And so let's turn to take a look at his variation on these ideas on the next page. So, what is it exactly that Mill taught about ethics? Well, you'll get a chance to read a fair bit of Mill yourself, and I think you will find it perhaps a bit more approachable than some of the other texts that we've looked at, in part because Mill is writing closer to our own time than really any of the other figures that we've looked at so far, with the exception of the Budziszewski natural law chapter, which is very recent. But he's certainly more recent than somebody like Aristotle or Hume or even Nietzsche. Well, actually, maybe not more recent than Nietzsche, but contemporaneous. But the difference would be that Mill writes in English, whereas Nietzsche writes in German. So we're not dealing with any translation here. You can read Mill for yourselves. And I think he spells out his ideas fairly clearly, really, in his work called Utilitarianism. But I think it would be easier for you to read that if I introduce some of the basic ideas of the system ahead of time, and then you can read and see in detail how Mill develops his case for utilitarianism. But on a really basic level, of course, as I already said, for utilitarianism, pleasure is good and pain is bad. And certainly on that really basic level, I think all philosophers, all ethical systems would agree in and of itself, pleasure is a good thing and pain is a bad thing. Of course, the difference is here it becomes really the primary criteria for right and wrong, where it's not that in other ethical systems. Now, as I said, Mill makes this a little more sophisticated, I think you can say, than Bentham does. So when Mill is talking about what is going to be the right action or the moral action, he's going to argue that it's whatever course of action is going to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain for everybody affected by a choice or by an action. So this is not just about individual pleasure and pain. It's not just about mine. It's about everybody who's affected by a particular choice that's being considered or a particular action that's being judged. So what we need to do is to try to take into account all the consequences produced by an action, right? And utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. We didn't really talk about consequentialism as a separate category because really utilitarianism is the primary form of consequentialism in ethics today. So a lot of times we tend to just talk about utilitarianism as more or less all kinds of consequentialism. But that being aside, what we need to do is look at the consequences of an action. So we're going to say, well, look, if I'm going to do this, who is it going to affect? It might affect me. Should I help an old lady across the street? Well, it's going to help me, or it's going to affect me. It's going to affect the lady. It might affect the other drivers who have to stop. It might affect whoever she's on her way to meet. And so to the best of our ability, we need to take into consideration everybody who's going to be affected by a choice. And now, of course, it's going to be difficult because the degrees of involvement people have are going to vary. The amount of pleasure and pain produced for different people is going to vary as well. But to the best of our ability, we need to take everyone that we can into consideration in reaching a decision. So that's what's going to determine if something is moral for Mill, is that we need to maximize that ratio of pleasure to pain. Now, this is one of the ways that Mill really builds on what Bentham had said, because Bentham basically just on a pure pleasure pain basis says whatever produces the most pleasure is good, and the least pain is good. What Mill does is to introduce the idea of higher and lower pleasures. And so he's going to argue that it's not simply the case that we ought to go out and party and have the best time we can in terms of those kinds of behaviors, but in fact, there are higher pleasures that are worth much more in Mill's view of things. And this is one of the areas that's really important to understand when we're talking about utilitarianism. He's going to explain in the course of the work you're going to be reading that it might seem like going out and partying is going to be what utilitarianism is going to tell you to do. And in fact, there are going to be people who choose to do that. But he's going to say, well, look, people who go out and party versus, say, work on their education, there's two reasons why they might be doing that. One is, look, some people simply don't have the ability to appreciate the higher pleasure of an education, or they simply haven't been introduced to it. And so he's going to say, well, look, these people are essentially a lower type of person, and for them, the pleasures of partying is really all there is. And so they don't, basically they don't know or they don't understand what they are missing out by not receiving an education. So they might be content just partying their lives away, but Mill is basically going to argue that they're living like animals. In places he even talks about them. These are basically like pigs. You know, they're very happy and they're rolling around in the mud and eating the slop. And they might be perfectly content, but they're only content because they fail to realize that there are much greater goods out there. And so he's going to say, now other people might go out and party as opposed to working on their education, but that's because they understand that there are higher goods, but they're giving in to kind of momentary temptation. He's going to say, well, we can all recognize that people can know that it would be better to, say, study and get an education and still choose to go out partying. But those people know that, in fact, when they really reflect on it, that they're making the wrong choice, which is a different sort of situation. And he's going to say whoever has actually experienced and understood the two types of pleasures, when you really ask them to reflect on it, they're going to say, well, look, obviously an education is a higher pleasure. And he's going to compare this, it's not just education and partying, this is true in lots of different areas, you know, enjoyment of the arts, enjoyment of philosophy, he would argue, all kinds of intellectual endeavors, but also things like career success and success in one's family life, standing in the community. All of these things are kind of higher pleasures. And so we don't want to think of utilitarianism as telling us just to do whatever's going to feel good. In a certain sense, that's true, but what Mill means by what feels good is going to include lots of these other things that we wouldn't tend to think of in connection with the idea of pleasure necessarily, but are in fact pleasurable on a kind of higher, more sophisticated level. And really, he's going to say, how do we know what the higher pleasures are? Well, he's going to say, if you take someone who's experienced this range of things, who's experienced career success and family and standing in the community, and ask them whether or not they would rather go back to this kind of animalistic sort of lifestyle where they would be ignorant and enjoying themselves, Well, those people are going to they don't want to do that, even if the higher pleasures are more difficult to attain, and even if it might require you to give up some kind of lower pleasures in the meantime. People who really understand the higher pleasures are still going to choose them in the long run. Now, of course, people argued then and now that Mill is basically an elitist and that there is no real basis for this distinction between higher and lower pleasures. And that's a debate that still goes on today. Now, I would think that you have to have some kind of distinction like this in order for utilitarianism to be a useful ethical system, right? If your ethical system just tells you to have as much physical pleasure as you can at any moment, living by that ethical system is probably going to lead to very bad outcomes in terms of people's lives. So there needs to be some sort of recognition that there are higher goods that we need to pursue as people to be truly happy. People will, though, I think, take issue with some of Mill's distinctions. So, he would see, look, you have almost a moral obligation to cultivate these higher virtues and learn to appreciate opera over, say, reality TV or NASCAR. And, in fact, you're acting essentially immorally by spending your hours watching reality TV and NASCAR. And that, I think, some people might argue that there is no real moral difference between opera and, say, television watching. But to me, at least, it seems like Mill might have a point there, although I think Aristotle might be helpful in saying that all things in moderation might be the best course of action. But we can leave that for the time being. And as I noted here, there's the higher and lower pleasures. It's also not the case that pleasure needs to be understood in terms of kind of immediate consequences, right? So it's not just, if I do this now, will I feel pleasure and pain now? We need to think about long-term consequences, and even in ways that we don't really see how an action will bring us pleasure or pain. In Chapter 5 of Utilitarianism, which I'm not going to ask you to read, he talks about kind of the concept of justice, and that we have an obligation to, for example, recognize other people's property rights or to follow basic laws of civil society. How does that fit into his ethical system? Well, he basically argues that following those kinds of principles of justice, those legal obligations, does in fact produce pleasure and minimize pain, and it does it by making possible civilized society. And he basically argues that having a civilized society is necessary for really living a life of pleasure, and certainly living a high life full of the higher pleasures. You can't have opera and philosophy if everybody's running around whacking each other with sticks and getting drunk all the time. So even though when we might think about whether or not I should avoid insider trading on Wall Street, it's not clear how following the rules of Wall Street is going to produce pleasure for me. And this might seem like a problem with Mill's system, but Mill's going to say, well, it does ultimately, but it does it in a kind of abstract way, that following these rules allows us to have an ordered society, and an ordered society makes it possible for us to enjoy all of these higher pleasures that we can get from living in civilization, basically. And again, this is also where he's going to allow us to talk about things like rights and duties that we would have. And rights and duties in Mill's system are, again, ultimately based on utility, based on whether they produce pleasure and pain. So he's not going to have this kind of natural law view that human persons have intrinsic rights to not be violated. He's going to say that we need to recognize the rights of people in society, but not because of some character of a human person per se. It's not because human persons are sacred in the way that natural law would say. For Mill, people have rights because you need to have personal rights in order for society to function, right? So that we need to recognize the rights of innocent individuals to not be attacked or have their stuff stolen. But it's only because acting that way makes possible society, which makes possible higher pleasures. And if you really get in an extreme situation, using Mill's logic, if we need to violate the rights of one person in order to provide a great deal of benefit for a large number of people, a great deal of pleasure, and a great minimization of pain for a lot of people, then ultimately Mill's system would say, well, then you can violate a person's rights in that situation because they don't really have rights. They have rights insofar as having those rights contributes to the pleasures we get from society. But if violating those rights will in fact bring more pleasures to the society as a whole, then in Mill's system it would make sense. It would be the, in fact, moral thing to do to violate that individual's property or bodily health or what have you. So that's basically what utilitarianism is, and utilitarianism as it's going to be spelled out by Mill in your reading. Now, having just run through all of that, I want to just take one moment to go ahead and respond to some typical criticisms that people make about utilitarianism, especially when they first encounter it in classes like this. And I apologize if some of this is repeating things I just said, but I've just learned from experience that even if you present utilitarianism in kind of the outline I just gave you, people still tend to think of it in certain ways that don't really reflect what utilitarians themselves teach, or even what Mill himself lays out in his work. And again, often, regardless of what I might say in the initial introduction, people get this idea that utilitarianism is selfish, that it's really about maximizing my pleasure and minimizing my pain. But again, that's not the way utilitarianism really works. Now, it is true to say that there are certainly a lot of people who would say they're utilitarians who, in fact, use it in a selfish manner, right? Who really are only concerned about their pleasure and minimizing their pain. But that is a criticism of those individuals. It's not a criticism of utilitarianism as an ethical system. That's what's known as an ad hominem argument, right? An ad hominem argument is when you attack your opponent's character, you attack something he's done, but you don't really attack his ideas, his intellectual argument, right? And so, yes, there are certainly utilitarians who use it in a selfish way or to justify selfish behavior, but that's not what really utilitarianism as an ethical system is about. And so we should judge the system based on what the system says, not on how some people abuse or misuse it, right? Again, utilitarianism, as Mill himself is going to explain, is not about maximizing my pleasure. It's about considering the effects on everyone and then choosing the course of action that maximizes pleasure for everyone as a whole, everyone affected by a choice. And in fact, if I am a good, consistent utilitarian, there might be many instances where what my utilitarian ethics are going to tell me to do is in fact going to require me to suffer. It's going to require me to sacrifice a great deal of pleasure, because by doing that, I'm going to produce more overall good for everyone affected by my actions. Look, any ethical system can be distorted or manipulated to serve somebody's purposes, but that doesn't mean that those ethical systems are inherently flawed. It means somebody's twisting them, right? And the same thing is true here of utilitarianism. So that's one thing to make sure that we're clear on. The other is, again, that it's all about pleasure, that it comes down to just enjoying yourself and feeling good. And to a certain extent, this is right. But again, it's important to remember that there are higher and lower pleasures. If we're going to talk about pleasure in Mill's sense, including things like succeeding in one's career, like attaining kind of a high degree of education and intellectual pursuits, it's going to include having good standing in the community, good family relationships. Well then, that's a fairly broad understanding of pleasure, and it also, I think, takes away some of that criticism that, oh, well, look, all these people are really interested in is their pleasure. If we're going to include those kinds of things in what we mean by pleasure, then that doesn't seem like such a bad thing, right? In most of the ethical systems we're going to look at, things like Aristotle, things like natural law, they're going to say that we ought to pursue goods within a successful career and good family life and education and those sorts of things as well. So I don't think it's really a fair criticism of utilitarianism to reduce it to kind of hedonistic pursuit of bodily pleasure, because that's not what utilitarianism, at least as explained by Mill, is really about. Now, another criticism is often raised is, well, how on earth would this work? It's not really possible to come up with an equation for the pleasure or pain produced by particular actions. We might be able to do it on some level if, should I or should I not go up and hit somebody on the head with a hammer? Well, we might be able to, that's a fairly simple situation, but even there, a critic might say, well, look, for utilitarianism, we need to think about everybody involved. What if this guy was going to go on to be an axe murderer, right? How do we take that into consideration? What if this person were going to go on to discover a cure for cancer? That it seems like if we're really going to take into consideration all of the effects of an action, it's going to be impossible ultimately to decide whether or not I should hit this person in the head with a hammer. And so what would a utilitarian say to this? Well, there are a couple ways of responding to this. One is to say something that we'll look at on the next page, is to say, well, look, we need to think about rule utilitarianism, which, sorry for the phone, we'll stop in a minute. Rule utilitarianism is going to say, well, we don't need to think about all the consequences of every action. We need to focus on what way in acting in general is going to produce the best consequences, the most pleasure, and the least amount of pain. Another option would be to say, well, look, you can make this criticism of any ethical system. There's always going to be cases where it's going to be very difficult to figure out what the right course of action is, regardless of your ethical system. If you recall from Aristotle, he's going to say that we really need to consider the circumstances that particular actions are occurring within, and then use prudence to figure out which actions are in fact going to fit the golden mean and produce virtue, and that is going to vary depending on the circumstances. And you could come up with situations where that's going to be a very complex process. And the same is true of natural law. There are going to be situations that are very complicated and difficult to figure out what course of action is in keeping with our nature and what is not. And so for any ethical system, one could respond by saying, look, we're only morally responsible for what we can really be reasonably expected to know about a situation. And so a utilitarian would say, well, look, you need to base your decision on the best possible understanding of the pleasure and pain produced that you are able to attain, that we can reasonably expect you to attain. It's going to be unreasonable to expect anyone to have a complete understanding of all the consequences of any action. But everyone's understanding is going to be limited regardless of the ethical system they're following. So yes, it might be tough to figure out the utilitarian equation for different actions, but that's going to be true that they could respond of any ethical system, really. And then lastly, a lot of people would look at utilitarianism and say, well, look, this way of deciding what to do could produce situations where it's going to approve of an action that just seems terribly wrong. And we can come up with situations where you could have, say, one innocent child and come up with some sci-fi scenario where, look, we need to painfully and slowly extract something from this child that's going to kill him, but in the process we are going to save thousands of lives with this substance that we extract. It would seem like, if you do the numbers right, that utilitarianism is going to tell you that this is the moral course of action. As long as the overall benefits, the overall pleasure produced is going to outweigh the pain suffered by the individual, then we can do it. And even in less extreme, non-sci-fi scenarios, it would seem like utilitarianism could tell us to go ahead and eliminate a small minority that is really strongly hated by the vast majority of a population, right? If that minority's presence is causing displeasure for a huge number of people, well, then it would seem like eliminating them would in fact produce the most overall pleasure, happiness in this community. Therefore, it's the moral course of action. And so there are lots of situations where we can come up with scenarios where it seems utilitarianism would tell us to go ahead and kill or eliminate or violate some individual or some minority, as long as the numbers of people benefiting from their elimination are big enough, basically, if we can get the calculus to work out. And I think this is the most serious objection that we could raise about utilitarianism. And that's really the focus of the development of rule versus act utilitarianism that I want to look at on the next page. Now, really since the beginning of utilitarianism, utilitarians have been faced with that sort of an objection to the system, that it seems like it can approve of the violation of individuals or minorities if it's going to produce the most overall pleasure for a larger group. So how can a utilitarian respond to that? And the primary way that they have responded is through the development of something called rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is basically what we've been talking about up to this point. And the way we make moral decisions is looking at particular acts and deciding whether or not this course of action in this situation is going to produce the most pleasure and least pain, or if some other choice is going to do that in this situation. And what rule utilitarianism does is it kind of broadens our perspective. It broadens the scope. And it says, we're not really only concerned about this particular situation. What we need to do is to decide what way of addressing these types of situations is going to be the most beneficial rule of action from a utilitarian perspective. So they're going to say, well, look, if we had this extreme situation where painfully killing this innocent person was going to produce enough benefit for the larger society, so we ought to do this, well, the utilitarian is going to say, if you really think about it, though, if we set up this rule in our society that we will painfully kill innocent people if it's going to make more people happy, that having that rule as part of your society is in fact going to make people very unhappy, right? If you have people wandering around every day wondering, is today going to be my day to be the poor innocent person that's painfully killed, that in fact is going to cause a great deal of suffering in this society. And so we need to take into consideration the impact that acting in a certain way is going to have on the society as a whole if it's establishing a rule of conduct. And so they would say, well, look, the best rule to follow in organizing our society is to say that individuals should not be painfully killed in order to produce more pleasure for the majority. So our rule will be to respect the rights of individuals. and that rule will in fact produce the most overall pleasure. And so that's one way that utilitarians respond to that. Now, ultimately, whether or not that succeeds is an open question at best. It turns out that if you really think about it and pursue it, it's not clear if you're ever able to escape that situation. If we have that rule in place, it seems like we could come up with situations where it would be so extreme that the rule just still wouldn't really apply, and there would be no reason to follow the rule in this very extreme situation where the stakes are huge, and it seems like we still, from a utilitarian perspective, need to violate the individual or the minority. There's also problems that result from rule utilitarianism. Is what happens if two rules come into conflict. If we have a rule of promoting the health of our population over and against a rule of respecting the rights of individuals, how do we decide which rule to follow in this particular situation? And so ultimately, I think there's no way to get around reducing it to an analysis of what is going to produce the most pleasure and pain in this situation, taking into consideration as many people as we can. Now, there are a number of other variations of utilitarianism that have been developed over time. Two-level utilitarianism, total advantage, average utilitarianism. There's different systems for making the calculations, but really it's all ultimately going to boil down to what is going to produce the most pleasure and the least amount of pain. And it seems like, at least from my perspective, however you tweak the equations, you can't avoid situations where utilitarianism is going to tell you that the correct course of action is to, in fact, violate some individual or minority for the good of the whole. Now, there are going to be people who agree that if the stakes are high enough, there's nothing that we can't do. But for many other people, it's going to seem like there are things that you shouldn't do no matter what, even if it's necessary to save your life, to save the life of your family, to save the life of everyone you know. You simply ought not to do certain things because they are intrinsically immoral. Right? So a natural law perspective would say that, would say, look, there's certain things you just can't do, and it's never moral to do regardless of the circumstances. Utilitarianism ultimately is going to say, in extreme situations, there's really nothing that you can't justify if the stakes are high enough from a utilitarian perspective. And that's, I think, the ultimate real question about these ethical systems and the real question about utilitarianism as a moral system as well. So that's an introduction to utilitarianism and what it's about and how it works. And so what I want to do now is to encourage you to read the sections from Mill yourself that I posted on Blackboard, and then to answer a few questions that I'll give you on the next page. So now that you've taken some time to read Mill for yourself, or once you do read Mill for yourself, a couple questions I'd like to ask you. And again, I would encourage you to ask any other questions you might have from the reading. But first off, does Mill's argument work? Does it convince you? Does he convince you that pleasure, pain, and utility are really the basis for our moral principles or not? And why does he convince you, or why does he not convince you? And then secondly, I guess what I just said, what other questions do you have from reading Mill for yourselves? And then lastly, what do you think about this problem that I just discussed on the previous page? Are there certain things that you could never do regardless of the utilitarian stakes? Or would you agree with the utilitarian principle that you could, in fact, morally violate an individual or violate a minority if the utilitarian stakes were high enough, if the greater pleasure produced were great enough? And why or why not? Why do you think the way that you think about that? So those are the questions I'd like you to discuss on Blackboard. And again, certainly let me know if you have any other questions about this or anything else that we're doing in the course.